I'm Ryan Bracken. I work for DroneSense. I have a challenging position there, which is a combination of helping customers be successful, as well as running the security side of things. So that tension will play out as we talk about some of the concepts around privacy. I would like this to be interactive. That may mess up the video here. What I'll try to do is, if you guys see something, please stop me. Just raise your hand, whatever, yell it out. I'll try to repeat the question and then answer it. I think it's just going to be more valuable if we do it that way. You'll also find, as I go through some of these slides, that there are people here from some of the states that I call out, specifically Illinois. Feel free to jump in anytime. I'll try to kind of respond to that as we go. So there are lots of motivations to use drones. This conversation is really aimed mostly at public safety. There may be people from the private sort of sector as well here using drones for other stuff. It applies to you too. When you collect information, it does create a privacy impact on the people around which you're flying. So the motivation though is strong to use drones, obviously for search and rescue, for surveillance, for forensic imagery collection. Those are sort of the common roles that we think about. Also for pre-event imagery collection. Dropping objects, maybe that's not a big privacy issue, but there's many other uses being pioneered, many of which will impact this discussion around privacy. So one of the first questions that an operator really needs to ask before they fly, or an agency begins a platform or a program, is what authorities apply to me as an operator? If you're in the United States, obviously FAA policies around airspace and operations apply. Also mission requirements. What am I trying to accomplish, and what are my authorities for doing that? And then the last bullet there, what we'll be talking about today, are the privacy and accountability policies that you might need to address. So to boil all that stuff down, am I authorized to fly this aircraft, this particular type of aircraft, this payload, everything that I've got, in this airspace at this time? Do I have an authorized purpose for this mission? Is there somebody above me that said, yes, you, Detective so-and-so, and of this police department can fly in this location for this reason at this time? And then the last one, this thorny issue that we need to talk about today, really is, am I properly safeguarding the privacy and civil liberties of the community members that I'm here to protect or serve? So that's what we'll spend most of our time. First of all, what would be a discussion about privacy without defining it first? What I've found is that privacy in legal terms is actually extremely complicated. We won't go into all this stuff. We'll talk about the definition Merriam-Webster says, which is basically the quality or state of being apart from company or observation, or freedom from unauthorized intrusion. Drones provide both. They can intrude and disrupt your secluded sort of, you see this farm field out here. You may not anticipate being intruded upon by something in the air, but it also has the possibility of creating an observation where you might otherwise not want to have that. So what does that mean in the context of your equipment, of your software, of your operating principles and your policies? So we often look to manned aviation for some guidance. This might provide the underpinnings. And in fact, I've sat through some very notable, very elite law enforcement agencies, some of their drone training, and they look very heavily to their manned aviation platforms to say, hey, I've got $1 million sensor flying around here on a multi-million-dollar aircraft. What's the difference between that and a small drone? And in some cases, the analogs are good ones. But you'll also find, like the Inspector General for DOJ found in his analysis, that UAS do have some differences. Things like persistent surveillance. If you have a tether or something like that, you may be able to be up for days at a time. And just the sheer scale of that, or the ease or the low cost of those operations, do materially change this discussion. I probably should have said this right off the bat. I'm not an attorney. Are there any attorneys here? Yeah? No? I feel so much better already. We're not going to talk about civil liability. I am not qualified to discuss what you might be liable for if you are sued, who's going to protect you, or how to stay out of that. Talk to your legal counsel about that. Use this material that I'm providing, and I hope you'll reach out to me. Happy to connect you with other operators that are doing this stuff and looking at this. I'm not going to talk about civil liability. I'm not going to talk about, anybody know what tort is? Yeah, I mean, anybody, law enforcement, you'll know what tort is. But a tort law is also something that's it's not going to be easy for us to dig in today. I also don't know how to drive legislation. I'm not a politician. I can't tell you how in your town or your city or state how to drive that forward. But I can connect you with people that have done that successfully. Some of them are here in this at this conference. I'll be happy to connect you with them. So who am I and why am I talking about privacy after that lengthy disclaimer? I spent 12 years with FBI. I was a special agent there. In New Agents class, I don't know if they're still doing this, but one of the things that we did near the end of New Agents class, of course this was a million years ago, we went to the Holocaust Museum. And they took us in the back and they gave us a really detailed historical explanation of how things kind of went sideways in Nazi Germany. And so that was something that really has impacted me, has impacted the way I think about privacy and civil liberties, particularly as it relates in this case to UAVs. So it's something that I'm passionate about, not just the performance of your job, which I am responsible for in some ways in our company to make sure that your performance is excellent, that your drones work and you get the job done, but also that not just in the letter of the law that you're protecting your community's civil rights, but also truly in the spirit of the law, that you are doing the right things, making the right decisions, and I'm happy to help however that might be. Okay. Privacy and accountability are the number one concern most people have about UAVs outside perhaps of the discussion we had this morning. Hopefully you guys caught Mr. Elwell's discussion about airspace. That's a huge concern. Of course we don't want these things colliding with manned aircraft, but aside from airspace concerns, the number one thing you'll get is that people are worried about the impact they may have on their privacy. We'll examine some key privacy guidance. So you've got the Constitution, that's an important one. The Privacy Act of 1974 predates drones, not quite as predated as the Constitution, but early. And then we also have the Presidential Memo 2015, DHS paper that provides some great guidance that I strongly recommend. If you're building out your platform, get this in front of your legal counsel and use that stuff. Someone's already spent a bunch of time, put a bunch of lawyers in a room and figured out some really key concepts. Use that stuff. I'll be happy to get you links. And then also just some state and local laws. There are a bunch of privacy-related laws that do impact the way we can use drones. First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, we have the Privacy Act that we just talked about. You have HIPAA, federal, you have FISMA, ECPA, and then a bunch of state laws. What are we to make of all this? First Amendment, just as a quick refresher, we aren't going to talk about this. I'm not going to read you every word. What is the First Amendment? In the end, it's freedom of speech. It's peaceably assembling to basically be able to get together and do stuff without fear of that speech or that assembly being quenched by the government. This is very important. If you have, say you're providing support for a special event, so I've been did Super Bowl, the Indy 500, these are big events, but nobody in their right mind is really going to call them a demonstration or a protest. There's not a whole lot of First Amendment issues there. If you, however, have a religious gathering or something like that in your neighborhood that you're going to provide safety coverage for, you have to look at that very carefully and understand, is this surveillance of a First Amendment protected right? And also consider the suppressing effects that simply your presence may have by flying in that location at that time. Then you have the Fourth Amendment. And this is, basically you need a search warrant if you're going to go into somebody's house. You have the freedom to unauthorized seizures or searches of your persons or property. So what part of a drone employment constitutes a search? In the state of Virginia, pretty much if you're going to fly the drone in someone's backyard, if it's not, within the curtilage of something, if it's within the curtilage of their house, you're going to need a search warrant to do that. What is it in your state? The interpretation of this amendment is key to you understanding how and where you can fly your drones. And there are extraordinarily variable interpretations of that from one state to the next, from one community to the next. There's a lot of case law on this. There's a building group of case law for UAS, but there's tons of historical case law. Another thing we need to point out here are sensors. If you're flying a visible sensor, that gives you one set of capabilities. If you're flying a visible sensor with a huge zoom, like a 30 power or 100 power zoom, that gives you another set of capabilities. At what point do you need a search warrant? If you're using thermal or hyperspectral or some other type of capability, make sure that's included in your analysis. So in the Privacy Act of 1974, there's not a heck of a lot here that's specifically addressing drones. I mean, it was written in 1974. But one of the big things that's really important here is that it does not specifically also apply to state and local governments, nor to private companies. Now, once you start pulling PII, it does become important on some level. But again, I guess the key point here is that there is no real direct legislation for UAS privacy. So now you get to state laws. Illinois, sorry guys, we're calling you out specifically. There's some extremely, what I would call almost draconian rules around what you can do with that information that you've collected. So you go out and you collect, it's not violating First or Fourth Amendment issues. You go out and you collect that information. Now what can you do with it? How long can you retain it? In the state of Illinois, you can retain it for 30 days without having a reasonable suspicion that information is relevant to an ongoing investigation. Very low bar. That's in terms of law enforcement. That's not a very high bar to maintain a piece of information under that level. But that means you have to have a system in place where you can actually enact that. Do you have an automated way to put that stuff in a particular location and have it expunged after 30 days if it hasn't been marked appropriately? And I guess I would urge you, before I move off this slide, depending on what state if you're a state or local agency, what is your state law? Have you looked at it? Have you sat down with your counsel and gone through it line by line to make sure that your policies are actually capturing that?
Question?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm actually from Illinois.
Yes.
But I'm not a regulator. Regulators are in Illinois, but so just using Illinois as an example, if I've got some operation in mind, probably need to apply for a waiver, OOP waiver for it. What steps can I take to, make sure I'm in compliance in the state of Illinois? What are resources I can consult, who can I talk to, before I get too far down the road?
So if you're, in whatever state you're in, the first thing I do is I try to connect people. Part of my job is I get to talk to law enforcement, fire rescue people all day, every day. So through those conversations, I learn that there are certain people who have really become experts in that area. So the first thing I would do is connect you with somebody in that state, who's going to be able to kind of hold your hand and say, okay, I've been through this with our attorneys. Here's the way we interpret it. And that can really narrow things down, or at least highlight the areas that are going to be most important to you. And then it's really just about creating a systematic approach to acknowledging these particular operational limitations. So what sensor am I using it? When and where? Am I authorized to be there by airspace? And then, of course, this discussion on privacy, making sure that at the very least, that what factors are going to matter for that situation. Yeah, but I think like most things, what I would do is connect you with somebody in that area who has gone down that road that can easily point out the potholes for you. Yeah, go ahead.
We're from Illinois, Police Department of Illinois, and this is only for law enforcement for 30 days, but we can connect with you and get you on the right page. But yeah, Illinois is basically, the city of Chicago runs Illinois, if you want to call it that, for those of you that are from the area. And we have big problems with our downstate Springfield in order to change laws. but of course, the city of Chicago kind of runs the state. So it is a challenge for us, but it's funny because our fire department could do whatever they want, or any fire department can do whatever they want in the state, but police departments can't. So the city of Chicago too, the county, it's called Cook County around the city of Chicago. Even the state's attorneys in Cook County had a problem with us writing search warrants. We had to get a separate search warrant for a property in which we had human bones on, and the FBI was actually involved in it as well. And they looked to us too, the FBI, because they had no idea as well, because it's new to them. But yeah, the problem with Illinois is you talk to people that are in Southern Illinois, it's like a whole nother state, and the state's attorneys interpret the law differently. Cook County, it's different, so and I'm sure that it's like that in most other states too, depending on the counties and the state's attorneys and how amount of time they have.
Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up. One of the key things I heard you say there is that there's a difference between the way fire the way they're handled by, by different states and different local laws. Fire is often given much greater latitude than law enforcement agencies for obvious reasons. There are concerns that community members have about their law enforcement folks using these drones in certain ways that they don't have about fire rescue. They want their houses protected in the case of a fire or a search and rescue mission. However, what I do see is an awful lot of collaboration between both. Particularly for smaller municipalities, fire is going to help out law enforcement when they don't have the capacity. And so it's really important, even if you're from a fire discipline here in this room, if you're helping out your law enforcement brethren, you may need to understand what some of these privacy rules are as well. Because in effect, doing this work under the auspices of the law enforcement agency, you may have to be beholden to those rules as well. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, which brings us to local laws. We're almost done with this little section. This one I came across and I just had to put it up here. This is Newton Falls, Ohio. I can't remember when this came out, and I don't know if it still stands, but this was their interpretation of the Fourth Amendment right to freedom from illegal search and seizure. So a person is presumed to have a reasonable expectation of privacy on his or her privately owned real property if he or she is not observable by persons located at ground level in a place where they otherwise have a legal right to be, regardless of whether he or she is observable from the air with the use of an unmanned system. So that is pretty much it's probably the most challenging privacy law I've seen around the use of UAS in terms of the Fourth Amendment interpretation. What does this mean? This means anything that would be viewed above ground level, so not just flying over their backyard, but just to be over the public road and fly straight up and look behind someone's fence, that's going to need a search warrant in this locality. Can you operate your drones under this kind of statutory authority? And it's going to be a challenge. So I would just urge you to work with local lawmakers, particularly if you are a local agency, and especially if you're local law enforcement. I would urge you to describe the way you use your drones, what kind of information you're gathering, what you're trying to do, not to carve out extra space for you, just elbow room to trample people's rights, but so that you can have a thoughtful interpretation of something like the Fourth Amendment. Why is that so important? If it's not thoughtful, generally people will end up violating those rules. So I think in this industry, in this community, we have to work together to try to create a set of rules that we can all work within. Okay, so that was a bunch of kind of rules and laws. Now let's talk about some policies, some things you can use to help build your own policy. So Congress passed the FAA Modernization and Reform Act in 2012, which really ushered in the requirement for integrating the UAS into the National Airspace System. In 2015, President Obama released a presidential memorandum which is promoting economic competitiveness while safeguarding privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties in domestic use of unmanned aircraft systems, which is a mouthful. But the key thing is it's giving guidance to federal agencies, not state and local, just federal agencies. But what you'll find as we go through here, there's some valuable material for everybody in here. It's giving some guidance to lawfully implement drone programs, to really help, boost that that industry without just crushing civil liberties. So the key language is they acknowledge, and the White House does in this memo, that UAS will provide a lower cost of operation in some cases, augmenting existing capabilities, and reduce risks to human life. So some really strong basis for doing this. But they want to do this in a way that protects privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. So in terms of privacy protections, we'll break this into kind of a few different groups. The collection and use of data. Agencies shall only collect information using UAS with an authorized purpose. So it's kind of what we talked about before. So as we talk through here, think about your authorized purpose. So when we are flying a crime scene, or you've got a house on fire or something like that, the authorized purpose is pretty obvious. I need to collect this particular information. Where it becomes less easy to articulate is things like large-scale events. If you're at an event with 500,000 people and you have drones up, what exactly are you doing? What is your authorized purpose for that mission? But be thinking about that, not just at the program level, but all the way down to the individual drone pilot. Retention. In here, anytime you collect PII, and what does PII mean? I was talking with Fane last night about PII, and what does PII mean within the context of, it's personally identifiable information, if I didn't say that earlier. What does that mean in the context of a drone? If you're looking at a random crowd of people that has no indication where they are or who they are, is that PII? Well, probably not. If you're looking at somebody, you can see their license plate and their location, and they're in front of whatever establishment they wish they weren't, or someone wishes they weren't, maybe that's PII. It becomes PII very quickly. But what we don't have is a whole lot of information, a whole lot of research that has been done to define that level. So if it is PII, which you guys should know when you see it, hopefully you're reviewing your stuff, you can only retain it for no more than 180 days unless it's necessary for a number of reasons. And then dissemination. What are you going to do? Once you collect that stuff, it's good information, you're going to hold on to it. To whom are you going to give it, and why? Okay, then the civil rights sort of side of things. First Amendment, we already talked about. Don't do stuff that will violate the First Amendment rights of your citizens. Then the lawfulness of UAS activities. Again, operate in a manner that's consistent with those rules. And then I think the most important part of this on this page is come up with a way to address privacy complaints. So what are your procedures and policies to collect this information about your flights, and what kind of system are you going to use to store it? Do you have a place where you can pull up all of your flights, and if someone comes in and says, you were violating my privacy, you flew over my house and you were looking at my pool, do you have a way to address those concerns? And if you don't, you really are opening yourself up to some he said, she said situations, which depending on your locality may be a challenge for your agency. Okay, and then for accountability. Oversight procedures are important. You need rules of conduct and reporting misuse. This is a culture of, it can be a challenge in any culture, but especially in this culture, we need to call ourselves out and say, hey, this is something I did. I violated one of our procedures. You have a way to call yourself out, document it, and move on. Oversight for PII, and then again, data sharing agreements. If you have any data sharing agreements with other agencies where you automatically share stuff, make sure you view that very carefully within the context of your UAS platform. So, assistance policy. The federal government is not going to assist you unless, and provide you that data unless you can articulate that you've, basically you can deal with these particular privacy requirements. And where the rubber really meets the road on this, if you can't address all of these key components, you really can't accept federal money of any kind for a UAS platform. So this is where, if there's a challenging bullet in all this, most of us, most of the customers I talk to, they do want or need some level of federal funding for the UAS platform. Things are expensive, and they're, the technology is awesome, but it's mostly not free, and federal grants are a great way to help boost your platform. However, you really can't accept it without a system within which to deal with that. Okay, so transparency is something that, as a former FBI employee, transparency is a challenge for me. It's always, not that you hide behind the wall of some sort of wall of secrecy, but that I believe, particularly with UAVs, and I believe the same for other emerging technologies such as facial recognition and different machine learning, AI, that transparency is actually one of the greatest assets you have to help people feel more comfortable. The more transparent you are, the more they understand what you're doing, and just honestly what you're using the data for, the more the public will feel comfortable with what you're trying to accomplish. So tell the public where you're using UAVs. I would say publicly address civil liberties. Right off the bat, I would say, hey, we know civil liberties are a big concern. This is what we're going to do to make sure we're protecting your rights. And then this last one is probably tough for most of us, and when I said that this would be tough for me, I think that most of us should be looking at a way to publicly report our UAV operations. So maybe it's just number of hours broken into training and operations. Maybe it's something more detailed to that. Maybe you put up a heat map on your county GIS website. You decide how you might want to implement this, but this can go a long way to providing transparency for your community members. So if you'd like to read this yourself, here's the link. Feel free to take a picture. I'm sure the slides will be available. I would strongly urge you to sit down with this. It's really not that long of a read, and it provides some really valuable, I think, thinking points for any, thoughtful program. So from that memorandum, that went to DHS, and DHS then put together a lengthier but also relatively succinct document about privacy protection. Basically, there's a redacted version that is available online as well. So I'm just going to go through here. There's 15 of these. First, it's not always fun to do it, but consult your legal counsel. Bring them in, sit them down, figure out, in layman's terms, describe what you're trying to accomplish, and kind of walk through some scenarios. Okay, if I were to do this, what would I need? Do that with your legal counsel. Clearly state, and this is one of those deceptively difficult things to do, but clearly state the purpose of your unmanned aircraft program. I know that sounds really simple. I've found tremendous difficulty in coming up with a single kind of purpose statement for the platform. But again, that's something that you can share with the public. And then stay focused on that. As you go, you'll get pulled in many different directions. People are going to ask you to assist with various types of missions, and then figure out, is this within the scope of our stated purpose of this platform? Because you're only going to really have done the civil liberties analysis within the context of that scope. All right, so then designate an individual responsible. Maybe this is realistic, maybe it's not for your agency. But if there's somebody who's watching the news and watching the community's reactions to things, as well as watching your own purchase of equipment and operation styles, it's going to be good to have someone to raise their hand in the meeting and say, yeah, I know we're using that superpower zoom camera for that demonstration downtown, but I think that's a little questionable in terms of how we're going to articulate that to the public. It can be good to have somebody responsible for that. Pick a contrarian, they'll enjoy doing it. All right, so then, staying involved, conduct that privacy impact assessment. If you don't know what that is, you can look those up. They're pretty easy to do. It's basically just to what degree and in what ways could this impact the privacy of our community. And then here's a really tough one. Limit the collection, the use, dissemination, retention of UAS-derived data as much as possible. If you don't need to take the picture, don't take the picture. If you don't really need to be there, don't be there. There's plenty of legitimate authorized missions out there. You don't need to take information or collect information that you don't really need. Okay, so respect the Constitution, have a redress program, ensure accountability. Generally, that's going to mean some sort of software tool that you're going to use to put everything in there, or make sure that if you're using Excel spreadsheets, that you're doing that faithfully. Security, we're going to talk about that more in a minute. None of this really matters if you end up accidentally divulging this stuff onto the internet through whatever means. So security is a huge part of that. Review what you're buying, transparency, outreach, training, and then of course this last one, develop a procedure for handling those unmanned aircraft support requests. So how am I going to analyze whether I do this mission or not? If you're a fire department and the law enforcement agency comes and says, hey, we've got a SWAT mission, we need to go into this door, can you help us out? Is that legitimate or not? Is that a good use of your equipment? Probably, but have worked that out in the first place and have a system by which you're going to evaluate whether to do that mission or not. So I mentioned security. It is critical to understand for you to protect your people are putting a lot of trust in you as maybe a government operator to collect information that may be sensitive or otherwise people don't want divulged. Maybe it's their backyard. So security is a key component. And we can talk a little bit about data and media management. So once you've collected that information, you're now responsible for that. You've got this 4K image of some sensitive area. It's on you to make sure that it doesn't go into the wrong hands, that it's not divulged to the wrong people. So policies and procedures to handle that, systems, secure systems within which to keep that data, having good tools to manage that security is critical. Policies and procedures are also a huge part of that. So, do you have a pile of SD cards laying around that contain hundreds or thousands of images from who knows which scenes? That's probably going to be a problem. That's something that little things like we've got little cards over our booth where you can stick SD cards in. Keeping that stuff organized can be really important. But then what's your procedure? Do you take that card out and put it directly into a computer, upload it into a system of record, and then delete that? Or do you put it in an envelope? How do you handle that stuff is going to make a big impact on whether people's rights are really their privacy rights are really being fully protected. Checklists are also good. Okay, so key privacy questions that we talked about are where can I fly and where can I look? Those are two different things, and acknowledging that that where an aircraft is flying is not necessarily where they're looking. In some cases, dramatically different, particularly with high power zoom lenses. And then what sensors am I using? Is it thermal or is it visible, multispectral, or some other type of gas sensor? All of which we don't have a whole lot of court case law to rely on. So a lot of it's going to come down to your agency in making a wise choice about how to employ that sensor. And then the question is, okay, I'm legal to be there. I'm legal to look where I'm looking. Should I press the shutter button or not? Should I collect that image or that video? Is it acceptable to do that? Okay, once you have done that, now how do I plan to use, analyze, or aggregate this data? So there's actually a lot in that one little statement or question. The analysis of that data, I was just talking with a fire department just a few moments ago who collects everything. And they retain everything, and basically that's the rule. Their attorney said, there's really no reason that you can't retain it. So unless there's a reason to get rid of it, you can, we prefer you get rid of it, but yeah, you can hold on to it. So the question is, if law enforcement then comes to them and says, hey, we've had a case that have you ever flown in this area? They say, yeah, sure enough, we have. Oh, and we've got pictures. What do you do then? Is it acceptable to provide that to law enforcement, or do they need a search warrant? Because law enforcement would have needed a search warrant to get there in the first place. So I know this becomes, I don't feel this is contrived though, these examples. This is stuff that is happening. So understanding, once you've collected it, you now own it. If you're going to keep it, with whom are you going to share it, and what legal instrument will you require to give it to them, if any? And then aggregating that data with other data. That's where people really start to become concerned. When you start to maybe aggregate this with biometrics or facial recognition or some sort of object detection, other types of data, maybe cell phone data or something else you get from subpoenas or search warrants. At that point, you begin to really adjust the type of information that can be gleaned from these sensors. So, do I have a solution to a policy on that sort of question? Okay, so we've hit a bunch of different concepts there. There's a lot to read about. Unfortunately, very little of it has direct case law or data associated with how many or how high, what altitude can I fly. But there are lots of good concepts here. One is the National Telecommunications Information Administration. There's a good paper here. I've got the link there, which I'm happy to share with you guys if you want to shoot me an email. And then also this Congressional Research Service, this primer that was written, I think in 2015, does a really nice job, a much more thorough job of going through civil liability and tort claims and all the things that are important for a drone program to look at. So yeah, that's my name. Ryan@DroneSense is my email. I hope that it was valuable to talk through some of these things for you. I know for me, boiling it down into some of those key questions, it's, as an investigator, you're taught, that ask those who, what, why, where, when, how. Is another one I forgot in there? No? Okay. But ask those questions about every drone operation. And over time, you'll develop a policy so that it's a little bit more routine. But these privacy concerns are something that I think early in the stage, like we are right now, is a great time for us to work together to really understand and implement procedures to protect them. We've got a few minutes left here, so feel free to, if you've got questions, be happy to talk over them with you. And otherwise, please feel free to reach out, Ryan@DroneSense, and we'll get you the information we can. Thanks.